we are talking to Frances Itani, who is the author of The Company We Keep. And that's one of the books on this year's Grey County Reads. And actually, Frances has written 18 books. She's shortlisted for the Giller Prize and the Commonwealth Writers Prize, and she won the Commonwealth Writer Prize for the #1 bestseller, Deafening. And she also won the CBC Literary Prize 3 times. She's the recipient of the Library and Archives of Canada Scholarship Award, and she's a member of the Order of Canada. And she teaches Tai Chi. So Frances, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. Before you were an author though, Frances, you studied nursing and you became an ICU nurse. And it's a pretty dedicated one with all your postgraduate study at a number of universities and hospitals. And then there was a transition out of nursing that happened. And you went for a BA in psychology and a master's in English. I was wondering, was this transition easy? Was it a natural one? Some pull precipitated by a crisis? How did it come about?
Well, certainly there was no crisis at all. I was working away as a registered nurse. I was teaching nursing, but I wanted to do more schooling. I loved being at university. So I decided to go back and start working on an arts degree. And while I was doing that, I happened to move to Edmonton because and by then I was married. I had 1 baby when we moved to Edmonton, ended up having another one there. But while I was moving to Edmonton, I was looking up coursework and I decided to see if I could get into W.O. Mitchell's class in Edmonton at U of A, because I was working on my arts degree anyway. And I had stopped nursing, maybe just a year or 2 before, because I had a small baby. I love the profession. The profession of nursing is about human behavior. It's about people at their most vulnerable. It's about the human condition. I don't really see any difference between the 2 professions, to tell you the truth, except perhaps writing is more difficult. I think, yes, writing is difficult.
I'm sure it is. It requires a great deal of self-motivation, I'm sure. They say that the majority of startup businesses fail because people just can't keep their nose to the grindstone. So congratulations on that. But when writing became, shall we say, your day job, did your life change dramatically? Were you under pressure from agents, publishers? Did you have a writing schedule? Did they make you show up with so many pages a day?
Not at all. No,
Good.
and I'm a very disciplined person. I'm organized. I'm disciplined. I have no trouble, whatever. Working away, working every day. I work all the time, as much as I can. And I'm a hard worker. I love to work, but I also love to learn. So, this combination of being a writer and researching for my books, and it's just something I love to do. But I do that all the time. I'm really disciplined. And
you certainly are. You've written 18 books.
Well, I have, yes.
Yeah. But now, they're not 18 mysteries. They're not 18 romance novels. They have a really diverse subject matter, which appears to bring you joy because you love to research, I know. And you've said every book is a personal journey. So can you tell us how you arrived at the choice of what you want to write? You've spoken of following a voice.
Well, at the beginning, when I was first starting to write, I had 2 babies. So I studied with W.O. Mitchell. I studied with Rudy Weed out in Alberta before moving again to Ontario and then to New Brunswick, where I studied with Fred Cogswell, who was my thesis supervisor when I was doing my graduate work in English literature. And I'm just trying to. At the beginning, because I had small children, I had just only so many hours. I was doing 2 degrees at night. And so I was writing poetry. my first book was, in fact, yes, a poetry book, then a children's book. And in fact, I published 3 books of poetry before I published short stories. But it's not because I have a short attention span, not at all. It's because I only had so many hours in the day when I could work at my writing. And I think it would have been so frustrating for me to try to hold a novel in my head when I was doing all of these other things. That's why I think I delayed getting into the novel. So I was always, choosing subjects that really interested me, of course, and I wouldn't write about something that didn't really interest me or that I was going to have fun with or something that meant a great deal to me, because I have to live with that for quite a long time. With a novel, I have to live with that in my head for, anywhere from 4 to 6 years. But I was writing shorter pieces and short stories. I did 5 collections of short stories before I, wrote Deafening, which was actually my first novel. So, and now I do have the luxury of being able to hold a whole novel in my head at the same time. So now I'm, working pretty much exclusively on novels, but not totally, because I'm also working on children's books, and I'm halfway through a story collection, in fact.
Wow. Yes, you certainly take your time with every book. It's years, in fact, and I know you spend a huge amount of time in research. In the company you keep, you interviewed your friends about grief, and you research parrots. And always in your work, you have mentioned that there must be music and there must be art as well. But what is the whole process? What goes on in those years between first idea and a completed manuscript? What's the day-to-day? Surely you're not sitting at a desk the whole time. This must involve more of your research.
Yeah, no, I'm not at a desk, all the time. In fact, I'm sometimes just standing at the window, looking out. When I start out, it's with an idea or an image, maybe a theme. I mean, everything all of my work has to develop around theme, but I might not know the exact theme at the very beginning, at the outset of a novel, and of course it can change as I go along, and the same for a short story. But I usually start it out by hand, because there's some old mechanism there that works for me, because I used to write everything by hand in scribblers, and write on one side, leave the other page blank for editing as I went along and when I came back. And even though I work on computer now, I still start most of my books by hand, just to get some ideas going and see if I can work out a character or get a situation. And then I very rapidly move onto computer and start figuring out the decisions. There are very definite decisions a novelist has to make at the outset of a book. Oh. Temporal decisions, characters, structure. Structure is so important. Time is so important. Am I going to set this thing in 6 months, 3 days, 1 day, 10 years, 20 years, 4 generations, as in Remembering the Bones? Like, it's really important to establish that, but that takes a lot of muddling around and muttering around, before I get that right. Maybe in the first month or so, that happens. And then I start working out my characters and adding or deleting as I go along. So it's always in my mind. When I reach a point where I'm in fact dreaming about my characters, this doesn't happen right away. It doesn't happen for actually more than a year in, maybe 2 years in. When they're starting to have conversations in my head, in my dreams, I just get up in the morning and I think, I've got my book.
That's amazing. I do love the way you speak like a gardener when you talk about your characters. You said as the characters start to grow, as if it's not up to you at all.
Yeah.
I love that. Did you know that, speaking of your structure, the Google searches for how to write a book have doubled since 2019.
Wow.
I'm sure that's because of COVID. And the number one question that is asked is, do you just start writing or do you plan everything out ahead of time? So I'm sure each writer is probably different in that regard. but the research that you do seems to be half the joy for you of writing a book. Would that be right?
I absolutely never plan a book in advance. Never, never, never. It would just kill it for me. It would absolutely kill it. I have to let it just develop as I go along, thinking about it all the time, you know, liking my characters, choosing names for them that mean something, giving them professions. You know, I just really do mutter around. Like, you know, I talk to myself all the time. Oh, it would so kill a book for me if I planned a book and decided how many chapters or what it would be about or what, you know,
Right.
plot. Like there's no plot to any of my books. I work from theme. I want some really important theme. I want something to matter in my books. And so, and why are we having all these people suddenly write books? I mean, everybody has a voice, right? I guess everybody wants to have that, let that voice be heard.
Oh, absolutely. What about your life as a writer? You've mentioned your two kids. Oh, and here's something else, Frances, before I get into your children. There's just a passing reference to eloping with your husband. Now, did that involve ladders and second-story windows, or what happened there?
Almost. Almost. My husband is Japanese Canadian, and we've been together 53 years. And in the 1960s, when we were married in Montreal, it was very much frowned upon and not at all done to have mixed marriages. So we just decided to elope. It just made things easier all the way around, and then we just announced it.
Good for you. Saved yourselves a lot of money on weddings, I'm sure. That's what I keep telling my kids anyway.
Yeah, tell them to elope.
Yeah, it'd be a good plan. What was I going to ask you? Oh, yeah. Family life. My wife is an actor, and she leaves me with the kids occasionally when she goes to the other end of the country to work. We found that like very beneficial for all of us, for the kids, in terms of bonding and traveling, seeing the country. And you certainly traveled extensively, doing workshops and well, just being artist in residence. I wonder if the dynamic that I mentioned was similar in your family. Did the kids come to see you when you were moving around, or were
well,
they...
my children, I always put my children first. My husband had a job that we both still work full time, by the way. He's 81 and he's working full time. And I'm in my 70s and working full time, except my husband has unfortunately recently had a really traumatic accident. And so that is not, you know, so that's one of the things I'm dealing with now. In our normal lives, when our children were little, he was away a lot. So I was often a single parent. So it mattered to me that my children came first. I wanted children, and they absolutely took priority over anything that I was doing. Even, you know, even through exams, even through, you know, deadlines and whatever. I just had to cope. I had to work it out. And so I did a lot of that myself, even though, of course, the children are very close to their father, but he was often away. You know, sometimes he'd be away for 6 months. One time he was away for 2.5 years. That was after the children grew up, because he worked for the International Red Cross and the ICRC and the Red Cross, Red Crescent for humanitarian work and natural disasters. So he would be away, for instance, when the tsunami came, he was gone. He was gone for 6 months. When Pakistan had the earthquake and the flood, he was gone for a year. You know, I mean, that's what his life has been. And he's done very, very important and very valuable work internationally. So I'm the one who holds the fort. It's just always been that way. But our children are, of course, now grown up. But I'm the one who stayed at home, and despite the fact that I was, you know, did what I could as a writer and accepted as many invitations as I could, and certainly I can move about now as I wish. But that was my priority, and it was my responsibility.
That's wonderful. And then you moved them to Heidelberg.
Oh, well, that was with Ted, my husband. He had a job with NATO. Yes, with NATO at that time. I'm pretty sure it was NATO. And we lived there for 3 years. That was wonderful. I mean, this is one good thing about being a writer. A writer can just pick up the notebooks. And then at that time, I was writing everything by hand. I did have a typewriter shipped over, but a writer can move anywhere. I mean, I can live anywhere and still keep working, unless I have to drag 3 or 4 boxes of research along, which I don't do. So I stay put when it's a heavily researched book.
Right.
But in Heidelberg was wonderful. My children were 7 and 9 when we moved there, and we were there for 3 years, and we toured around. We traveled every weekend. I wrote during the daytime while they were at school. They were at a very small American school, a very small, actually Canadian school with 21 kids on an American base. I didn't live on a base or anything like that. I lived in a little tiny village. But life was very good to us in Heidelberg. That was a wonderful posting, and I loved living in Germany, and I learned the language there.
That's terrific. And your children, I guess, learned it as well to a degree?
To some degree, but I'm the one who was running the household in the German language. Everybody else had English. My children had an English school. I mean, I made them speak German when we were out traveling because I wanted them to learn as much as possible. And they were learning some French at school. But when they came home, when we came back to Canada in 1983, they both went straight, and my daughter into French immersion. And my son studied, he's a musician in Denmark right now in Copenhagen. He's with the Danish National Symphony. And he studied music in French language. So they both, our whole family is able to pick up languages pretty easily.
Well, yes, you've certainly lived in so many countries. So your son's a musician, which might explain the Itani Family Award for flute.
Oh, that's, yes.
Tell us a bit about
Yes.
that?
Yes, I set that up because Russell, our son, had such lovely years with the Ottawa Youth Orchestra Academy, and John Gomez was the maestro at that time. And I wanted to honor other flute students, flute or piccolo, in the winds department. And so I set up that award in perpetuity, more or less,
That's great.
for a young flautist. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I must shout out to all the other humanitarian work you've been doing by giving back. You're working with Big Sisters and the MS Society, Habitat for Humanity. Did you build a house?
Yeah. Well, I worked on a house. Yeah.
Yeah. And the Ottawa Deaf Center, you're on the board there, which I guess is as a result of researching deafness that led you to learn sign language as well.
Well, when I was beginning to write deafening, when I made the commitment, I thought, okay, there has to be a deaf community here in Ottawa. And if there is, I do not know the people who belong to it. So I just got onto the phone and phoned around and contacted the Canadian Hearing Society, and then found out there was a center called the Ottawa Deaf Center here. So I immediately volunteered to be a volunteer. I mean, this was not easy. I had to sit at a desk and be the person, I was the one who greeted people as they came through the door of this great big house where many, many activities went on and many learning situations and teaching and so on. And, people would come in and, they would speak to me in sign language, and I was just learning sign language. So I had to study it very quickly. I had, I think, about 4 teachers, 3 deaf teachers and 1 hearing teacher. So I was learning as quickly as I could, but it was frustrating for sometimes, not only for me, but for deaf people who were entering the building and were trying to tell me something, with their hands. So, I stayed on with them for several years until, in fact, it closed, and became very involved, and had many, and do have, deaf friends now. And just got so involved. I loved working with the community and being part of the community. And I was accepted, by the way. The reason I was accepted into the community is because my grandmother was deaf. So this is the sign for mother, grandmother, great grandmother, and so on as you grow up. But because my grandmother was deaf and not hearing, which is the sign for hearing, I was considered family. So I was just pulled into the flock, and I became part of that community.
And all the way, and you kept writing deafness throughout that.
I was working on deafening, yes, and then I, started to do the war. By the time I decided to add in World War I was already 4 years into the book, and I thought, oh boy, like if I include World War I in this, it's going to add another 2 years, and it did. And I went to visit the battlefields and started interviewing. There were still a few veterans alive from World War I at that time, and but it was, that book was such a journey for me. Oh my goodness, I'm so glad I took that journey.
Oh, I can't imagine. It's a beautiful book. I just want to go back. The sign for hearing what is that?
It means speaking. Isn't that interesting?
That is really interesting. Yeah.
Speaking person means a hearing person.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stay off discussing a lot about your book because we have an advocate for you who's going to be doing that. But I would like to know that the company we keep has 7 characters, including Rico the parrot.
Yes.
How do you structure this? So your character, Hasley, puts up a notice and 4 people respond. Did all 4 respond at once in your mind? Like, did one character come after the other? Because you said you started writing about the parrot. So as you progressed, did one character arrive, then another, and then you adjusted to make all 4? Because it seems like quite a challenge to have 4 in your head and at the get-go.
It was a huge challenge, and first of all, I wanted mixed gender. I wanted different age groups. Then I thought, okay, well, let's start with Hasley. Hasley's of a certain age, and then she puts up the notice, and who's going to respond? And then I was thinking, okay, how about somebody in their 40s? How about somebody in their 50s or 60s? Maybe someone around her own age in the 70s. And then, of course, there's a 6th character who is added later on. And he actually, it's hard for me to believe this, but by the time I had set up Tom and decided that Tom would be an antique dealer, I had Tom sitting in his store one day, and a Syrian refugee walked in off the street. I'm not kidding. That happened in my head. And I remember sending an email to my editor and saying, oh, a Syrian refugee just walked in off the street into the antique store of one of my characters. She didn't know what my story was yet. And I said, so now I have an extra character. So, in the middle of the book, here is a Syrian refugee. And normally one is introduced to the characters pretty much close to the beginning, but Alam was introduced, in fact, later. And I really liked that character. And then of course I had to research, Syrian languages, various things.
Right.
But the setting up of the structure for that, to me, the big challenge for me, and I've never done this before, not to this extent, was having 6 characters plus a parrot, 6 humans plus a parrot, and each had to have his or her own story, do something, start from a starting point to an end point, but also all together as a total, the 6 and Rico, 7th, the parrot, they had to have an overall arching story. So I was working with 6 individual stories and 1 overall story of totality. So that was my big challenge. And I love a challenge. So I just worked it out. I said to my editor, I'm doing this sort of strange thing, but I said, I can do it. And she said, Frances, I have absolutely no doubt whatever that you can do it. So, just left up to me for the next 2 or 3 years to do it.
Are you lucky that way in terms of editor, agent, and the the free reign they give you, there doesn't seem to be a time constraint. I don't know from publishing contracts or anything like that, but there doesn't appear to be any delivery date required.
That is not true, actually. I do have, I usually sign 2-book contracts with HarperCollins. So I do have delivery dates, but I make them reasonable. And I have a great agent, Jackie Kaiser, and a great editor, Jennifer Lambert. Prior to that, it was Phyllis Bruce, until she moved over to Simon & Schuster. And Phyllis and I did about 7 books together, I think. And Jennifer and I have done 2 or 3 together now. And oh, they give me a total free rein. I mean, not to do with contract. I always meet my contracts, so that's not an issue. This year might be a little bit different because COVID has changed everything. However, we switched books, during COVID because the company we keep was supposed to be the second of this particular 2-book contract, but we just decided to bring that one out first. And it's so interesting that, in fact, to me, it speaks to what's going on now, which was entirely unplanned, of course.
Oh, doesn't it though? Yeah, yeah. And it's timely for you too, in a way, because we're all reaching that age where one by one our friends are dropping off. Grief and sadness is becoming a part of our lives, unfortunately, but that's.
Well, it is, but fortunately, my book is also about hope and about connections, among people. And it's just ironic that I have to do all of my book events virtually. My book, which is about getting together and about people supporting one another, I have to do everything in total isolation. And my audience is all, isolated as well. And it's just such irony.
Yeah. But you've recently written a short story about COVID, have you not?
I have, yes. I haven't, I'm actually still revising it thematically. But yes, I've written quite a long story. Well, it's long, it's 5,000 or 6,000 words. And I'm still debating what I'm going to do with it thematically. Yeah. It has to really count for something.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be difficult as we have variants coming in all the time. They're throwing new characters at you for that, whether you like it or not, aren't they? That's something. Here's another one from the net. How to write a book. How do you break a writer's block? Is the question. Now, is there even such a thing as a writer's block?
Not for me. No, I never have writer's block. I just simply never do. And I wouldn't even consider it. It would probably stop me in my tracks if I started thinking about that. My God, I have enough on my plate to worry about and to think about and to do in my profession. And oh, Lord, writer's block. No, when I was working with W.O. Mitchell, when I was just starting out, I remember saying to him, because I was only working on story, I shouldn't say only, because stories are very important. It's a wonderful genre, which I love. But I remember saying to him, okay, I'm working on stories. You're always writing a novel. How do you get up in the morning and manage to sit down and face a whole great big novel? And he just looked at me and he said, you go where it grabs you the most. And I've never forgotten that advice. And it's just the best advice. I mean, if I come to my computer and I can't stand working on, whatever's in front of me, I flip to another chapter. I go to the end. I write the ending. I write the middle. I go somewhere else. I work with another character. There's always something that's a challenge to work with, but I never work on something I don't like working on, because what's the point of forcing it? It'll just be bad writing.
Well, that's so interesting. There's no notion of nose to the grindstone and pushing through the tough parts, you're saying.
Oh no, I'm not saying that at all. Oh my goodness. No, every book, has problems. Every story has huge problems. And the writer has to write her or his way through those problems. But for me, that's kind of an end game, when I'm just getting the book together and starting to, make parts work with one another and getting characters to interact and have conversations and moving them from place to place. That's a very different kind of writing from solving the problems editorially at the end. I mean, I can edit my own work, and I'm good at that. It's one of my strengths. So, oh no, but that's definitely writing through the problems. I know how to do that. I love that part, but that doesn't come till much further on. That's my favorite time in a book. It's the last year, but especially the last 6 months of the book. And that's what keeps me writing all those years to get there, because I know how pleasurable that is. It's just an amazing, it just provides me with so much happiness to get to that last 6 months. And then I just love solving the problems and editing and peeling back and making it tight and, paring it down to the bone. And, that's my favorite time.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. We don't have a lot of time, but I got to tell you that I loved your radio play, Keeper of the Cranes.
Oh,
from
how
so
did you
long
get that?
ago.
Yes.
I was working at Jarvis Street Studios at the time, and my good friends were in it, Franny Hyland and David Hemblin. And yeah, it was really, I didn't recognize your name at the time. I was young, self-interested. It was all about me. But I certainly do remember the play.
Well, I was just starting out. And Jean Bartels, that was the last play that Jean Bartels produced for CBC. It was that full hour, wonderful time when, dramas were done, radio dramas were done for a full hour. And she believed in that play, and she believed in me. And I've been lucky to, meet up with people who did believe in me, like W.O. Mitchell, right? Who became a very, very close friend, and very dear friend.
Nice. Yeah, and wonderful fellow.
I'm now really close friends with his son, Orm, and Orm's wife, Barb, who live in Peterborough. But Jean Bartels believed in this play, and she wanted to do it, do it right. And she had great actors in it. And yeah, that was such a lovely experience for me.
Certainly the golden days of radio back then. Peter Zosky had radio plays every morning. It was a terrific time.
It was.
I'll let you go now. I know you have to get on to your next Zoom meeting, but it's a little easier than having to leave the house, I suppose, sometimes. So thank you so much for this time. After we've all had our shots and take off our masks, I'll come to Ottawa and I'll take you out to brunch.
Oh, let's do that. I love brunch. Let's do that. Yes.
Sounds
and
like
thank you. I loved being here, and I hope you will tell me who's defending my book. Who will it be? Oh
yeah, it's his name is J.D. Moffat, and he's the morning show host on, I'm looking up the number, yeah, it's 99.3. It's the radio in Meaford.
Oh, okay.
Which is right on Georgian Bay, beautiful spot.
Sounds great. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Everybody, you have to go to Frances's website. That's francesitani.com. There's a lot more fascinating stuff about her, and you can follow everything else on Grey County Reads, as so can you, Frances.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Much appreciated.
Bye.
Bye.